The boy named Farrokh Bulsara was beaten, bullied, and broken in boarding school. What happened to him in those dark halls would haunt Freddie Mercury forever, shaping not just his music, but his entire persona as rock's most theatrical performer. This is the untold story of the childhood trauma that created a legend, and how a frightened boy from Zanzibar transformed his pain into some of the most powerful music ever written. St. Peter's Boys' School, Panchugni, India. 8-year-old Farrokh Bulsara stood alone in the dormitory, homesick and terrified, separated from his family by thousands of miles of ocean. His parents, Bohemian and Bulsara, had made the difficult decision to send their son to boarding school in India for a proper British-style education. They believed they were giving him opportunities. They had no idea they were sending him into a nightmare that would scar him for life. What happened to young Farrokh in those boarding school years remained locked away for decades, revealed only in fragments to his closest friends and hidden between the lines of his most powerful songs. But understanding that childhood trauma is essential to understanding Freddie Mercury. The flamboyant costumes, the commanding stage presence, the desperate need for love and acceptance. It all traces back to a frightened boy who learned that to survive, he had to become someone else entirely. The separation. The trauma actually began before Farrokh even reached boarding school. In 1955, at just 8 years old, he was taken from his home in Zanzibar, a place of warmth, family, and belonging, and sent across the ocean to a cold, strict institution where he knew no one. For a sensitive child, the separation from his parents and younger sister Kashmira was devastating. Years later, Freddie would tell Mary Austin that he remembered crying himself to sleep every night for the first 6 months at St. Peter's. He said he felt abandoned, even though rationally he knew his parents were trying to help him, Mary recalled. But 8-year-old children don't think rationally. They just feel the loss. The journey itself was traumatic, a long voyage from Zanzibar to India, during which young Farrokh became violently seasick and spent most of the trip in a cabin, alone and miserable. When he finally arrived at St. Peter's, perched in the hills of Panchugni, the school felt like a prison to the homesick boy. But the physical separation from his family was just the beginning of his ordeal, and what happened next would change him forever in ways nobody could have predicted. The bullying begins. St. Peter's Boys' School in the 1950s was a harsh place, built on British colonial education principles that valued discipline, conformity, and masculine toughness above all else. For a boy like Farrokh, sensitive, artistic, and different, it was a battlefield where he was hopelessly outmatched. The bullying started almost immediately. Farrokh's teeth protruded prominently, giving him a distinctive appearance that older boys immediately targeted. They called him Bucky, a cruel nickname that referenced his dental condition and made him deeply self-conscious about his appearance. The teasing was relentless, and it planted seeds of insecurity that would follow him throughout his life. But the mockery about his appearance was only one form of the abuse young Farrokh endured. His Parsi heritage made him an outsider among the predominantly Indian and British students. His sensitivity and gentleness were seen as weakness in an environment that celebrated aggression and competition. His natural inclination toward music and art rather than sports marked him as different in a place where different meant vulnerable. Former classmates who were later interviewed about Freddie's childhood painted a picture of relentless psychological warfare. Farrokh was excluded from social groups, had his belongings stolen and destroyed, and was subjected to the kind of constant low-level cruelty that leaves no visible scars but causes profound psychological damage. He tried to make himself invisible, one former schoolmate recalled. He'd walk with his head down, avoid eye contact, try not to draw attention to himself. But somehow that just made him more of a target. But what the bullies didn't know was that their cruelty was creating something powerful, a survival mechanism that would eventually transform into Freddie Mercury's legendary stage presence. The physical violence. While the psychological bullying was constant, there were also incidents of physical violence that Freddie rarely discussed, but that clearly left deep marks. In the brutal hierarchy of boarding school, younger and weaker boys were often subjected to ritualized abuse by older students, and the staff either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. According to fragments Freddie shared with different confidants over the years, there were multiple incidents where he was physically beaten by groups of older boys. The attacks were sometimes random, sometimes targeted, but always terrifying for a child far from home with no protection or refuge. One particularly traumatic incident, which Freddie mentioned only once to Brian May, involved being locked in a storage closet for hours as punishment for some minor infraction. The darkness, the confinement, the helplessness. Brian noted that even decades later, Freddie couldn't be in enclosed spaces without experiencing anxiety. His famous preference for open, spacious homes with large windows traced directly back to that childhood terror. The physical abuse taught young Farrokh a cruel lesson that would shape his entire life. The world was not safe. People could hurt you at any moment, and your only protection was to become strong enough that no one would dare attack you. This realization would eventually fuel his transformation into Freddie Mercury, a persona so powerful, so commanding, that it became armor against a hostile world. The escape into music. In the midst of this nightmare, young Farrokh discovered the thing that would eventually save him: music. St. Peter's had a piano in the common room, and Farrokh began spending every available moment at those keys, teaching himself to play by ear. Music became his sanctuary, the one place where the bullies couldn't reach him. His natural talent was immediately apparent. By age 10, he was playing complex pieces and beginning to compose his own melodies. The school recognized his ability and enrolled him in formal piano lessons, providing the one bright spot in an otherwise miserable existence. When his fingers touched those keys, Farrokh Bulsara could forget the loneliness, the fear, and the daily humiliation. He could become someone else, someone powerful. But here's what nobody understood at the time, and what makes this part of the story so crucial to understanding Freddie Mercury. Music wasn't just an escape from trauma, it was a transformation of trauma into power. Every song he would later write, every performance he would deliver, carried echoes of that desperate need to transcend pain through artistic expression. Peter Freestone, who knew Freddie better than almost anyone, once observed, "Freddie didn't just perform music, he used it like a weapon against everything that had ever hurt him." When he was on stage, he was proving to every bully who'd ever tormented him that they were wrong about him. The formation of defense mechanisms. The years at St. Peter's taught Farrokh survival strategies that would become core components of the Freddie Mercury persona. Unable to fight back physically, he learned to use wit, humor, and theatrical presentation as shields. He discovered that if he could make people laugh, they were less likely to hurt him. If he could entertain them, they might accept him. This realization led to young Farrokh becoming something of a performer within the school. He'd do impressions of teachers, tell elaborate stories, and organize impromptu concerts. The same boys who had bullied him began seeking him out for entertainment, and Farrokh learned a crucial lesson. Performance could transform your position in social hierarchies. And here's what happened next that would become the blueprint for his entire career. He realized that by controlling the performance, he could control how people saw him. But this survival strategy came with a cost. Farrokh was learning to bury his authentic self beneath layers of performance. The real boy, sensitive, vulnerable, afraid, had to be hidden away where no one could target him. What people saw was the entertaining persona, always on, always performing. This split between public performance and private reality would characterize Freddie Mercury's entire life. Brian May later reflected on this dynamic. Freddie was always performing, even in private moments. "It took years of friendship before I realized the flamboyant personality was actually armor. The real Freddie was much quieter, more vulnerable, and deeply scarred by whatever had happened to him as a child." The Zanzibar Revolution, trauma upon trauma. If boarding school had wounded young Farrokh, the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964 nearly destroyed what remained of his childhood sense of safety. At 12 years old, Farrokh was back home on school holiday when violence erupted across the island. The revolution targeted the Arab and Indian minority communities, including the Parsi population to which the Bulsara family belonged. The violence was sudden and brutal. Farrokh witnessed scenes that no child should ever see: neighbors being attacked, homes burning, the social order he'd known collapsing into chaos. The family hid in their home for days, uncertain whether they'd be targeted, hearing screams and violence in the streets outside. When the British finally evacuated foreign nationals, the Bulsara family had to leave everything behind: their home, their possessions, their entire life in Zanzibar. They fled with only what they could carry: joining thousands of other refugees escaping the violence. For Farrokh, it was the second time in his young life that he'd lost his home and sense of security. The family relocated to Feltham, England, a working-class area near Heathrow Airport that couldn't have been more different from the warmth and color of Zanzibar. They lived in a small flat, struggled financially, and faced the subtle racism of 1960s Britain. Farrokh, now a teenager, found himself once again the outsider, a brown-skinned refugee in a predominantly white country that wasn't always welcoming. The creation of Freddie Mercury. The cumulative trauma of boarding school abuse, forced separation from family, violent revolution, and refugee displacement created a profound identity crisis in the teenage Farrokh. Who was he? Where did he belong? How could he ever feel safe in a world that kept tearing everything away from him? His answer was transformation. If Farrokh Bulsara was weak, vulnerable, and hurt, then he would become someone else entirely. Someone so powerful, so commanding, so impossible to ignore that no one would ever dare hurt him again. This is when the persona that would become Freddie Mercury began to take shape. At Isleworth Polytechnic and later at Ealing Art College, Farrokh began experimenting with self-presentation in radical ways. He adopted the name Freddie and later Freddie Mercury, completely reinventing himself with a name that suggested both divinity, Mercury, messenger of the gods, and fluidity, Mercury, the element that can't be grasped. The new name was a declaration. The hurt boy from Zanzibar was gone, replaced by something otherworldly and untouchable. The flamboyant clothing, the theatrical makeup, the commanding stage presence. These weren't just artistic choices, they were armor forged in childhood trauma. Every sequin costume was a shield. Every commanding gesture was a declaration that he could never be made to feel small again. Every powerful vocal performance was revenge against everyone who had ever told him he wasn't enough. The music of trauma. Understanding Freddie's childhood trauma transforms how we hear Queen's music. Songs that seem to be about love or fantasy are actually processing deep psychological wounds. Bohemian Rhapsody, with its themes of identity crisis and wanting to escape reality, reflects the dissociation strategy Farrokh developed in boarding school. We Are the Champions, far from being just a sports anthem, is a survivor's declaration of triumph over those who tried to break them. Somebody to Love reveals the desperate loneliness of a child who learned that the world isn't safe and people can't be trusted. The Show Must Go On, recorded when Freddie was dying, echoes the survival mechanism he'd learned at 8 years old. No matter how much pain you're in, you keep performing because the performance is what protects you. Brian May noticed this pattern. When Freddie wrote about pain, persecution, or triumph over adversity, it wasn't abstract, May observed. He was writing about his own experiences, but in a way that made them universal. That's why millions of people connect with Queen's music. Freddie's personal trauma became a language for everyone's struggles. The price of transformation. But the transformation from wounded Farrokh to commanding Freddie came with enormous psychological costs. The armor that protected him also imprisoned him. The persona that made him feel powerful also isolated him from genuine connection. The performance that kept him safe also meant he could never fully drop his guard. Mary Austin, perhaps the person who knew the real Freddie best, saw this tragic dimension clearly. He'd built this incredible persona that made him feel invincible on stage, she said. But it meant he could never really let anyone see the frightened boy underneath. I think part of him was still that 8-year-old in boarding school, terrified and alone, no matter how many people were screaming his name. The psychological split between Freddie Mercury, the performer, and Farrokh Bulsara, the person, created a kind of internal exile. Even as an adult, surrounded by success and adoration, Freddie often felt fundamentally alone because no one knew the real him. The very strategies that had helped him survive childhood trauma prevented him from finding the connection and acceptance he desperately craved. His struggles with intimacy, his difficulty maintaining long-term relationships, his tendency to test people's loyalty with difficult behavior, all trace back to those childhood experiences. A boy who learned that people will hurt you, that nowhere is safe, and that you must perform to survive grew into a man who struggled to believe that anyone could love the real person beneath the performance. The gifts of trauma. Yet despite the enormous costs, the The childhood trauma also gave Freddie extraordinary gifts. The sensitivity that made him vulnerable to bullying also gave him the empathy to write songs that touched millions of hearts. The need to escape pain through performance gave him the drive to perfect his craft to levels few artists ever achieve. The fear of being seen as weak gave him the courage to be outrageously bold on stage. His experience as an outsider, first in boarding school, then as a refugee, then as a gay man in a homophobic society, gave him the perspective to become a champion for other outsiders. Queen's music became an anthem for misfits, weirdos, and anyone who'd ever felt like they didn't belong, precisely because Freddie understood that feeling from the inside. Roger Taylor recognized this. Freddie's pain made him a better artist. He could channel suffering into beauty in ways that people who'd had easier lives simply couldn't. That doesn't mean the trauma was good. It damaged him in serious ways. But he somehow managed to transform that damage into something that helped millions of other people feel less alone. The legacy of the wounded child. Today, when we watch Freddie Mercury command a stadium crowd, we're watching a masterclass in transformation. The frightened boy who was beaten and bullied in boarding school became a man who could make 80,000 people move as one. The child who was mocked for his appearance became a style icon. The refugee who lost everything built a legacy that will last forever. But we should also recognize the cost of that transformation. Freddie Mercury's incredible confidence on stage was purchased with a childhood of trauma. His ability to perform through any difficulty was learned from years of having to hide his pain to survive. The armor that made him seem invincible was forged in experiences that no child should endure. Understanding this context doesn't diminish Freddie's achievements. It actually makes them more remarkable. He didn't just succeed despite his childhood trauma. He alchemized that trauma into art that has comforted millions of people facing their own struggles. The boy who learned to escape pain through music grew into the man who helped countless others do the same. The message we must hear. Freddie Mercury's story carries a crucial message about childhood trauma. What happens to us as children shapes who we become as adults in profound ways. The wounds don't simply disappear with time. They inform our choices, our relationships, our very identity. But those wounds don't have to define us. With courage, support, and creative expression, even the deepest trauma can be transformed into something meaningful. For the millions who love Queen's music, understanding the pain behind the power adds depth to every song. We're not just hearing great rock music. We're hearing a survivor's testimony, a wounded child's triumph, a refugee's declaration that he could not be broken. Every note Freddie Mercury sang was an act of defiance against everyone who'd ever tried to make him feel small. The boy named Farrokh Bulsara was beaten, bullied, and broken. But from those broken pieces, he built Freddie Mercury. Proof that our scars don't have to destroy us. They can instead become the foundation for something extraordinary. That's the heartbreaking story of the childhood trauma that shaped Freddie Mercury and transformed Queen's music into anthems for survivors everywhere. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Mercury Moments family for more untold chapters from Queen's legendary frontman's life. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the power of transforming pain into purpose, and let us know in the comments how music has helped you overcome your own challenges. Until next time, remember, our wounds don't define us, but what we build from them does.